News important to America and vital to Oregon.
Businesses, labor, farmers, farm workers, faith-based groups, and human rights advocates have all patiently waited for comprehensive immigration reform.
Tonight, a roadmap to compromise.
We're talking about listening to each other for a change.
From a lawmaker who says he sees positive signs in our nation's capital.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to my colleague from Oregon.
Tonight, Oregon Congressman Kurt Schrader. From KGW News, this is Straight Talk with Laural Porter.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for Straight Talk. I'm Laural Porter. We saw a busy week on Capitol Hill as Congress tried to get some work done. Both the Republican-controlled House and Senate passed a budget before lawmakers recessed for a 2-week Easter break. We hear a lot about gridlock in Congress, but our guest tonight says he's actually seeing some good things happening in D.C. Oregon 5th District Congressman Democrat Kurt Schrader is here with us tonight to give us his view of what's happening in our nation's capital and share some of the concerns he has here at home. Welcome back to Straight Talk.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Let's kick things off with a political bombshell we heard about on Friday morning, just as Congress was adjourning. Senator Harry Reid, the minority leader in the Senate, said he is not going to run again. He's retiring at the end of his term. And then he turned around and endorsed Senator Chuck Schumer from New York, the number 3 Democrat, overlooking the number 2, Senator Durbin from Illinois. What do you make of all that? What does that mean for the Democrats?
Well, they're not going to be able to demagogue Harry Reid and the Democrats in the same breath. I mean, one of the things that our party's been dealing with is we've elected the same leadership again and again, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been very successful in painting Mr. Reid, Ms. Pelosi, and the President in a very unfavorable light. So Mr. Reid's no longer there. So now they're going to have to stand and fall, if you will, on their own merits and whether or not they're able to govern this country right now.
Well, let's talk about some good things that you see happening in D.C. And you have discussed this week with the bill that's important to you. You have a new role on a powerful new House committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and you were able to sort of lead the way in getting a bipartisan bill passed to fix the so-called doc fix that deals with Medicare payments to doctors. Why is that important? How does it affect Oregonians? Well,
it's extremely important to every senior in America, and particularly in Oregon. One of the new books of business my office, unfortunately, has had to develop is one that finds seniors doctors that will accept Medicare. Medicare reimbursement has historically been pretty low. And what has happened for the last 15 years, there's been a scheduled cut to doctor reimbursement from the already low amount they get, oftentimes providing some of this care below cost. That was to go into effect like a 21% cut. And we've always kind of not let that happen because we don't want seniors to, not be able to see a doctor, especially here in Oregon. And we've patched it from time to time, done a little of this, done a little, kicked the can down the road. Well, amazingly enough, in Washington, D.C., on the other day, we had a huge vote on Friday, and it was Thursday rather, and it was pretty amazing. We ended up having 390 votes. Not since the 6.5 years I've been in Washington, D.C., we haven't had 390 votes for anything except maybe a post office. So 390 votes to finally say we're going to pay for at least a big portion of this pay cut that docs would see and make sure the seniors can actually get to see the docs they need to. And by the way, we also, thanks to Greg Walden and Peter DeFazio's leadership, got the Secure Rural Schools piece in there to make sure the schools...
for Timber County,
Timber County,
really important.
Timber County. So, and there were other key pieces of good Medicare reform policy that were in there, Laural. And Democrats had to accept that we've got to pay for some of these things. Republicans had to accept we're not going to pay for the entire bill. And there's some other sweet children health insurance programs reauthorized for 2 years for kids. That's a great win. The subsidy for low-income Americans to get to see their doctor, help them pay the premiums, that was permanently fixed too. So while we argue all the time, it seems like, and a lot of controversy, budgets, immigration, a lot of the issues you mentioned, occasionally we can do the right thing.
Well, I want to come back to how you did it with the No Labels group, but let me just touch on the timber a little bit more, because Josephine County was going to have to cut about they were losing about $1 million. They were going to cut 911 service, several law enforcement officers. So is this going to give you some time to try to come up with a permanent reform for federal forest policy so they can get more jobs going?
I certainly hope it does. It's not a full amount like we've had in the past. There still have to probably be some significant reductions in the counties because this is a stopgap measure, to your point. I think Greg Waldner has said this. I think Senator Wyden's also said the same thing. We need to have a productive timber policy, one that allows these communities to actually get to work in the woods, make sure the forests are healthy, and put these rural communities back on the map so they can enjoy part of the economic resurgence that we're starting to see in probably the more urban areas of our great state. So this is a bridge, a small bridge, but it's a small bridge that hopefully keeps faith with folks. And if we're lucky, as we get through this session, if we start to learn how to work together, I think there's an opportunity for an O&C type legislation, PILT legislation, these are forest policy bills to actually be implemented.
Well, on the theme of working together, you have this group, this No Labels group, and the two national chairmen of that group wrote a blog that was in Huffington Post this week. Former governor of Utah, Republican Jon Huntsman, and former Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman wrote an op-ed piece, and they credited you, along with Representative Ribble from Wisconsin, a Republican, for writing a letter last fall to the leadership trying to get this dock fix going. And here's part of what they said. They said, succeed or fail, the dock fix deal is a part of leadership in the House. It isn't a perfect solution. The costs are still up in the air, and both sides will have legitimate grievances. But what matters is the process and the precedent that it sets for the remainder of the 114th Congress. And they went on to say responsible lawmakers now have the opportunity to build a new nonpartisan coalition that's capable of solving problems. Are you encouraged that there'll be other places and issues that you can find bipartisanship?
I hope so. The No Labels movement, both nationally, outside of the Capitol, and with the Problem Solvers Caucus inside the Capitol, I'd like to think tries to find issues around which Americans can coalesce, where we can make some positive influence with our colleagues. The letter, I'm not sure it was completely the deciding factor for leadership to take this up, but I think if you're Speaker Boehner or Leader Pelosi and you see a significant number, 114 members of the House sign a bipartisan letter that we're interested in solving once and for all a permanent fix to the problem that seniors are facing, trying to get doctors, that emboldens you to say, okay, maybe I can reach out to my counterpart on the other side of the aisle, and we will have the votes in the center. The good thing, I hope, Laurel, is that this begins to do what No Labels has been trying to do all along, which is getting leaders to lead to the middle to solve the problems of America.
Well, by contrast, you were also working on the budget this week, and that passed in both the House and the Senate on party lines, Republican-controlled budget. And there, as I understand it, in the House, there were 12 different bills in something called the Queen of the Hill process that hasn't been used for a long time, where you voted on 12 different bills, and the one that got
I believe.
that got the most votes was the one that won, and I understand you voted against all of them.
Yes.
Is there a budget bill that you would accept that the Republicans might put forward?
I don't know if they put it forward. We put forward a bill not too many years ago, a budget bill. It didn't garner a whole lot of votes, but pointed at what we really need to be doing. And instead of budget theater, which those basically those budgets were well-intentioned by all parties, each party representing their own unique special interests, goals. None got at the underlying problems that the United States government faces in its budget crisis. The debt deficit are still very real, not talked about much now, but they're still very real. Sequestration, which is this across-the-board cut that we passed a few years ago because we couldn't do the right thing, that is really hurting our domestic programs and our defense industry at the same time, is now the law of the land. What we need to do, Kurt Schrader's budget would get rid of sequestration, because we're spending less than at any time since World War II as a percentage of our economy on both defense and education, healthcare, economy, transportation, you name it. Allow those budgets to get back up where we can actually do some competitive work to make our country great again and compete with these global economies around the world. And frankly, look at our entitlement programs. We have a lot of programs that are unfortunately in real trouble going forward, like Social Security and Medicare. We need to make targeted reforms, build on what we did in the SGR debate, in the
doc fix.
In the doc fix, we started some good, thoughtful reforms, been talked about for years, but no one having the political courage to do it. So hopefully we'll get to doing this, and that would be a budget that would, I think, if everyone's willing to hold hands and jump in together, should and would get a lot of votes. But right now, we're still playing politics.
Well, briefly, what happens next? Because the House and Senate passed a budget, but it's not the law of the land. It's a blueprint, and it breaks down into a number of other smaller bills that could become law. What happens for the Democrats?
Well, it's going to be interesting. The Senate budget is very similar to the House budget, and they balance supposedly in roughly 10 years. They make draconian cuts. They even double down even worse than the sequestration I mentioned a minute ago. Plus up defense, and they have a slush fund called the Overseas Contingency Account, i.e. the war budget, that they're going to secretly use, or not so secretly now, they're pretty open about it, to actually fund the Defense Department and not even go to the war at this juncture. It's a shell game and a poor, in my opinion, a strongly poor ordering of priorities for our country. Neither will go anywhere. The President will veto these. The President would veto these. The big question is, if this is their budget, how are they going to do those 12 appropriations bills? Dealing with education and labor, defense, agriculture, justice and science. They have to somehow mix this crazy right-wing budget into legitimate priorities, or they're not going to even get their appropriations bills out. So I hope some rationality comes into that process
we'll be
this summer.
Watching that budget and see if the No Labels group has a role in that. I want to ask you about something else we're going to be hearing a lot about, especially when you come back from recess, and that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a proposed trade deal with the United States and 11 Pacific Rim countries. It's something the White House really wants to see passed, although progressive Democrats are lining up against it, including Oregon Congressman Peter DeFazio. And as you know, I went and spoke with the President last month about the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. It was great to be there. And Congressman DeFazio was here on Straight Talk a couple weeks later, again, talking against the TPP and fast track. So let's listen to both the President and the Congressman, and I'll get your reaction.
Sure.
Ron Wyden, your senator, who's the ranking member in the Finance Committee and the Senate, has been very diligent in shaping an approach to trade that is going to ensure tough labor standards, tough environmental standards, and allows us to continue to access what is going to be the largest, most dynamic market in the world for generations to come in the Asia-Pacific region. We want to be selling, make sure China's not the one who's writing the rules, so we've got to get that bill done. It's really going to be important for Oregon.
They want to do this in a way that Congress has no say. They will present this, take it or leave it, the same way they did NAFTA, the same way they did the WTO, all of former disastrous trade agreements that have led us to having a $600 to $700 billion a year trade deficit, which means 100 millions of lost jobs, and undermining manufacturing in this country. They bring it to you, take it or leave it, no amendments allowed. That's says to me that maybe there's a little problem here.
So the Congressman's talking about the fast track, that you would be asked to up or down vote, no amendments. How will you vote?
Well, it will depend on what's in that fast-track legislation. If it does have strong labor standards that are enforceable, strong environmental standards that are enforceable, that it is much more transparent than they have been in the past, because I think Congressman DeFazio is correct. They have not been as transparent. There has not been as much interplay for Congress, potentially labor leaders, even some business leaders to play in these discussions. And it has to be updated to take care of concerns that have come up long after NAFTA became effective. We have these government-sponsored entities across the world now that compete against private enterprise here in America. They're stealing our intellectual property. There's data systems concerns. We have all sorts of issues now that also should be integrated into any fast-track authority or trade agreement like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If those things are in it, I want to be for trade at the end of the day. I'm a little skeptical, but the read, I just met with the folks on the agricultural sanitary standards the other day, and the buzz I got, and actually was able to look at the text, so it's not completely opaque. You can look at the text if you're a member of Congress. Showed that the significant movement's been made in the TPP in a number of agricultural areas, even with Japan, which I find to be almost impossible. So we'll see. But it's hard to be against something, Laurel, when you haven't even seen it yet. So I'm not going to be against something until I actually get to see it in front of me. And again, the President is correct. 95% of our consumers live outside the United States of America. That's the new rising middle class that we should be able to sell our stuff to. And I don't want China setting the standards. I want America to set the standards.
And briefly on the same subject of trade, before we go to a break, the Port of Portland is a key component for trade in Oregon. And we saw our largest container shipping company, Hanjin, leave. The last ship left earlier this month, taking 80% of the business with it. How concerned are you about what's going on out there?
I'm terribly concerned. That's why Dave Reichert from Washington State, Republican, and Kurt Schrader, Democrat, rallied together. And very proud of the Oregon delegation, the one state's delegation that got uniformly behind sending a resolution to the President of the United States saying, hey, get involved here. We let the negotiations go on for a long time, but it started to cripple the West Coast economy. And actually, we had people at the news conference from Washington, D.C., from Iowa and Ohio testifying how damaging this West Coast slowdown, strike, whatever you want to call it, at the end of the day was to our lockout, was to our economy. It was not a very good thing. It was, in my opinion, the greatest threat that our region has faced in a long, long time. Getting that hopefully settled. They're voting on the contract now. Will go a long way. Port of Portland's still going to have some more work to do, but I think you brought attention to it too, which is helpful. So it's a tag team event to make sure that we get our West Coast economy back on track.
Congressman, it's time for us to take a break, but we'll continue our conversation. Hopefully we'll talk about Oregon education coming up next, and we'll have our conversation with Congressman Schrader after the break. Plus, as Senator Ted Cruz becomes the first candidate to jump into the 2016 presidential race, we ask our commentators this question. Taking the Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling into consideration, how much of a factor will corporate money play in the presidential race? And does we need to act now to curtail this kind of political fundraising? We're back after the... Welcome back to Straight Talk. I'm Laural Porter, and welcome once again to my guest. We're talking with Democratic Congressman Kurt Schrader, representing Oregon's 5th District. Recently, you talked with the Salem Statesman Journal's editorial board, and you told them that you were worried about Oregon, that we're in tough shape. What did you mean by that?
Well, we are. I mean, I was shocked when the report came out talking about Oregon being last in the K-12 education arena. I mean, that... For as much time and effort and money that my state legislature works hard to try and make sure they have as best funding as they can do, and it's terrible to see that. Our funding is not good. The federal government, we have not lived up to our responsibility. We should be funding special education at that 40% level, not 12 or 15%. That could free up so much money.
And Oregon Republicans are saying that the budget isn't enough. It needs to be over the $7.2 billion the Democrats are proposing. Do you agree with that?
Well, it'd be nice. At the end of the day, you got to take from Peter to pay Paul, and that's something my state legislature struggles with. But we have other issues. We need to be more attractive to business in this state. The transportation package, the transportation deal fell apart. And at the federal level, we've kicked the can down the road on transportation. We can't come up with a coherent forest policy that could put into schools by increasing the vibrancy and wealth of these small rural communities. The port issue you alluded to before, that's a big black market if a business wants to. What's my ability to get my product to market on this West Coast in the Port of Portland like it is? And then well-intentioned, but different discussions about mandating what businesses have to have in terms of wages or benefits. That's not the way it works. We need to have a more coherent tax policy that makes sure people don't fall off a cliff at the end of the day as they lose their welfare benefits and move themselves up the pay scale at the end of the day. And so it's more than just the education issue. I'm very worried about the state of where my state, my Oregon, is at this point in time. We've got to figure out a way to get past all this.
We have about a minute and a half left, but what do you suggest that we do?
Well, again, I think the first step is a coherent tax policy, one that actually puts some money on the table, that actually is very progressive. I put one out there earlier with Ben Westland back in the day, Ryan Deckert, and Frank Morris, that would actually lower income taxes, make our state an attractive place to continue to do business. Right now, most of the people move across the river as their businesses become successful. We demagogue businessmen and women. You shouldn't do that. Lower those. Get rid of a bunch of the tax breaks, much like I'm advocating at the federal level. Get rid of the tax breaks for most people. Keep the mortgage interest deduction fine, but not a whole lot more beyond that. And let's get to where we can actually put in good breaks, make sure there's a graduated deal for people with child care, make sure they have a housing allowance, make sure they can get an education. And let's put a glide path in there for folks as they work their way up the pay scale. I think that's the biggest thing, Laural, at this age.
Only about 20 seconds, but are you hopeful in Congress right now?
I'm more hopeful now than I was a week ago. This deal on the doc fix is a big it sounds arcane here in Oregon, but it's a big thing if you're a senior citizen. It's a big thing if you're trying to make sure Medicare is there for the next generation, and it's starting to teach us how to work together.
Congressman, always a pleasure to have you here on Straight Talk. Never enough time, so I hope you'll come back soon.
Thank you.